Hello, good afternoon. Protests have erupted in cities across China as people call for an end to strict lockdown measures to curb the spread of coronavirus. In a show of defiance in Shanghai, China's biggest city, some protesters were bundled into police cars amid calls for President Xi Jinping to resign. Millions of people have been living with restrictions on their daily lives because of COVID. Well, our China correspondent Stephen McDonald sent this report from Beijing.
It's not unusual to see acts of defiance in China, but this was something different. A crowd of protesters in Shanghai chanted, calling for the country's leader Xi Jinping to stand down and for the Communist Party to give up power. A fire which killed 10 residents in Xinjiang last week has prompted widespread anger in China. Zero COVID restrictions have been blamed for hampering people's escape and slowing the access for fire crews. Whether this is true or not, it sparked waves of protest in the regional capital, Urumqi. This has now spread to other cities and university campuses as spontaneous memorial services for those who died in the fire have transformed into demonstrations, calling for an end to lockdowns, mass testing and other coronavirus measures. People are also blaming Xi Jinping personally for not easing the zero COVID approach, which is tanking the economy. Protests have been building in China all year, with people here increasingly sick of zero COVID restrictions. The government seems to have drastically underestimated popular discontent, yet for the moment has no easy way out of the zero COVID corner it's painted itself into. Stephen McDonald, BBC News, Beijing.
The Transport Secretary, Mark Harper, has said there must be reforms to the railway system to free up money for a pay offer in the long-running dispute that has led to nationwide train strikes. Speaking to the BBC's Laura Koonsberg this morning, Mr Harper warned there is not a bottomless pit of taxpayers' money to throw at the problem. Here's our political correspondent Helen Catt.
There have been repeated walkouts on the railways for months. Just yesterday, it was the drivers out on a day-long strike. Guards and signallers are among the staff who will hold another series of walkouts, this time for 48 hours each time, in December and January. This morning, the Transport Secretary Mark Harper said he wanted to see the dispute resolved, but he insisted a deal on pay must be funded by reaching agreement on changes to working practices.
Train operating companies and Network Rail will have the ability to reach a deal, but we have to be able to have that reform package negotiated, because it's only that that throws up the savings. I do not have a bottomless pit of taxpayers' money to throw at this problem.
The RMT Union's General Secretary Mick Lynch met with Mr Harper earlier this week in what's being seen as a more conciliatory approach from the government, in tone at least. But unions still want assurances that ministers aren't pulling the strings.
But what the unions need to know is whether the companies have authority to do a deal, because we know that every train operating company has a clause in its contract written by the government on dispute handling, but the unions don't know what's in it.
Labour has said it wants to see people paid fairly, but it has not said it would commit to inflation-matching pay increases if it was in government.
And you're asking me to commit to a specific number without having been invited into the negotiations and seeing the books. What I can tell you is that we think it's unconscionable that nurses and rail workers who went out and kept this country moving during a pandemic are not being paid enough to put food on the table.
Next month will also see nurses go on strike in England, Wales and Northern Ireland as a winter of more industrial action looms. Helen Catt, BBC News.
The Business Secretary, Grant Shapps, has written to energy suppliers telling them that households should not see their direct debits rise when their energy use falls. He's calling on energy companies to find a way to respond quickly to changes in household use, and he's asked the regulator Ofgem to report to him on how that can be achieved. Let's get more on this with our business reporter Noor Nanji, who's here with me now. What is the background, Noor, then, to this letter he's written?
Well, lots of us have been making efforts to cut down our energy use. But despite this, there have been reports of people saying that their direct debits are still soaring. So Grant Shapps says that he's disturbed by those reports. He says people's bills should reflect their use. Now, remember, Ofgem, the energy regulator, did already conduct a review into this earlier this year. We've reached out to suppliers to see what action has already been taken. But two things to note. Firstly, of course, energy bills are already going up. We know that. So even if you've reduced your use, your bills are on average going to be higher this year than they were last year. And secondly, some firms may have been caught out by the milder weather. Their calculations could have been factoring in a colder winter. Finally, just worth mentioning, you do have the right to challenge your direct debit. So if you think you're paying more than you should, you can reach out to your supplier.
Good advice. Noah, thanks very much indeed. Two 16-year-old boys have died after being stabbed about a mile apart in southeast London. The Metropolitan Police say they are trying to establish if the stabbings are linked. Let's get the latest from our correspondent Simon Jones, who's at the scene of one of the incidents in Thamesmead. Simon, what are you hearing from the police?
Well, the police were called just after 5 o'clock yesterday afternoon to reports that two young men had been stabbed. One of them here, one around a mile from here at Abbey Wood. Now, the air ambulance was sent along with several ambulances, but paramedics couldn't save the lives of the two boys. Now, I've been speaking to neighbours here who have been telling me of their shock. One of them said she heard screaming, looked out of the window, saw a huge amount of activity. Another told me that he had tried to give CPR to the boy who was killed here. Now, given that the attacks happened so close to each other and at a very similar time, the police are now trying to establish whether they are indeed linked. Now, officers here in London say they're determined to crack down on knife crime. A recent week-long operation saw 500 arrests and 130 knives seized.
Simon, thank you very much indeed. Simon Jones reporting there. Rescue teams in Italy are searching for around a dozen people who are missing after a huge mudslide on the island of Ischia. Houses and cars were buried in rivers of mud after torrential rain. At least one person has been killed. The Italian government's expected to approve a state of emergency and to give money to help rebuild damaged homes. And the World Cup in Qatar. Today's early games saw Costa Rica beat Japan by 1-0. Meanwhile, Wales will need to beat England in their final group match on Tuesday to keep their hopes of reaching the knockout stages of the World Cup alive. It's been a disappointing tournament so far for Wales, who've picked up just 1 point from their opening 2 games. Our correspondent Hal Griffith is at their training camp in Qatar with the latest from there. Hal.
Yes, we've been hearing from some of those players today talking about their real disappointment over that performance against Iran on Friday. It was a game which realistically defeated. They didn't really have much to offer. So how do they bounce back from that to what will be the hardest game in the group and maybe the game of their lives? As you say, Wales have to win and depend on another result going their way. Wales haven't beaten England since 1984. So is it mission impossible? That was the question put to Wales defender Ben Davies a little earlier on.
I don't think it's a question of trying to find that belief. We've got it in our squad. Everybody knows that we've got quality in them. We really do believe that we can win the game. We know it'll be hard and we know we'll have to be at our best to do it, but we have to give everything we've got.
There is a sense amongst the Welsh camp that they haven't shown their best and this might be their final opportunity. Otherwise, they'll be booking a flight home by the middle of the week.
Hal, thank you very much indeed. That's it from me. See more on all of today's stories on the BBC News channel. The next news here on BBC One at 3:15. Goodbye for now.